What's going on, guys? This is Paul Whitehorn with Dent Repair USA, and today we're talking about Autobody Materials and how it affects paintless dent repair and ultimately the cost of the repair. The terminology utilized to categorize steel products differs significantly across the globe. The metals used on most American cars is ultimately in the world auto steel format. Each grade of steel is recognized by the metallurgical type, minimum tensile strength, and minimum yield strength. So what kinds of metals do you have on your vehicle? Now, there are actually three primary categories. Number one is steel, number two is aluminum, and number three is high strength steel. But before we get into that, let's look at four other factors that affect all of these types of metals. As it relates to PDR, we're looking at metal based upon four primary categories. Number one, tensile strength. Number two, ductility. Number three, gauge. And number four, how that metal was formed. Number one, tensile strength, which is essentially the measure of force per unit defined as 1 Newton per square meter. This is the pounds of force per square inch, or PSI, which you might recognize, from your tire pressure. Now we convert this into MPAs, and that's how we're viewing the metal. At around 550 MPAs, or pascals, which is a PA, or megapascal, which is an MPA, right? That's where we're getting it from. Or newtons per square meter, which is essentially N/M squared, affects the amount of pressure the technician can use. So essentially, the tensile strength is how much force do I have to apply onto that metal in order to make it move, in order to make that repair happen. So that's number one. Number two is ductility and malleability. Ductility is essentially a metal's ability to be stretched into a thin wire, becoming weaker or more brittle in the process. It's the metal's ability to withstand plastic deformation before it actually ruptures or breaks out. This is absolutely critical when dealing with stretch dents. This is where a lot of guys run into some significant problems. If there's additional metal that's been created, this is running anything past 2.3 millimeters depth, where essentially additional metal was created in the core. What's the ductility? How far am I going to be able to go with that? That's why we're repairing things that are steel that we're not repairing in aluminum, as far as stretchness or depth is concerned on a repair based upon ductility and malleability. B, it deals with how the metal will take a strike downward with a tap down. Now that means that as I am making little small adjustments to the surface of your vehicle with a hammer and a tap down, that is significantly going to impact how well your vehicle's metal is going to perform. It also affects the temperature at which the metal should be repaired at. The ductile brittle transition temperature, or the DBTT, if a metal is cooled below this temperature, it increases its chance to shatter instead of bending or deforming in the way that we need it to. In metallic bonds, you have a valence shell electrons, and they're delocalized, and they share between many atoms. The delocalized atoms allow metal atoms to slide past one another without being subjected to strong repulsive forces that would cause other materials essentially to shatter. All of this to say that different types of metals need to be heated to different levels in order to be repaired. Number three, the gauge of the metal. Typically, metal today is going to run between 18 to 22 in gauge. The larger number with an auto body sheet metal is actually thinner. The lower number is actually thicker. So old cars from the 1950s and 60s are going to be using 18 gauge universally, and more of the modern cars are going to be using 22. However, there are certain places on a vehicle where thicker gauges are used depending on the year, make, and model. Like, for example, in a lot of trucks, you're going to see at least somewhere between 18 to 20 on a bedside of a vehicle. That's why it's more difficult to push. And number four, how that metal is formed. We're really only going to cover two primaries, and that's hot rolled steel versus cold rolled steel. Hot rolled is far denser and much harder to push with a lower ductile rating, and the cold roll rolled is far easier to manipulate, regardless of the same exact metal and gauge thickness. There are others, but these are the most common. Now, there's another little one, and that's bonding, and how these various metals bond with paint also affects our limitations. Okay, now let's get into the types of metals. Number one is steel. Typically, it's cheaper to work because of its great ductility, regardless of the gauge. However, we typically charge a little bit more for the thicker gauges, but for the most part, these prices are relatively similar. Now, steel is an iron alloy, and almost all iron by weight has small amounts of carbon and other materials in it. At an atomic level, the additional elements change the way the material behaves in a dramatic fashion when either hot rolled or cold rolled. So that's why you're seeing a huge difference when the production is different. Now, the way the carbon is managed during the production of steel is also key to its properties, but that's less so. Number two, aluminum. Aluminum typically costs between 20 to 50% more depending on the gauge and how it was formed. Aluminum is less ductile than steel. Furthermore, thicker gauges compound this problem further by producing an uneven, or what I like to call a black eye pea effect when pushing as a technician. Essentially, you're going to have, on a micro level, when you're making those adjustments, it's going to come up as, depending on the thickness and gauge of that aluminum, it's going to come up as twos. And anybody who's a paintless dent repair technician knows exactly what I'm talking about, because essentially you're going to have to make 4 passes for what you would typically on steel have to make for only 1. Let's get into high strength steel. High strength steel usually costs between 50 and 100% more of regular steel cost. One way to think of high strength steel is it's a low carbon steel. In conventional steel, the carbon content is about 1.4%. In high strength steel, it's about 1/6 of that amount. Typically, this is going to be thicker in gauge, which makes pushing far more difficult. For example, on this bedside that I did actually today as I'm doing this vlog, it has HHS steel, high strength steel, and its gauge thickness is 18, which is much higher than the 22 on the flare. Regardless of that, simply understanding the tensile strength, ductility, and gauge helped me determine what temperature I needed to heat this panel and how I needed to perform this repair, which we were still very successful at it. If you would like to learn more about this subject, please read Materials for Auto Bodies by Davies. This has been an amazing read. It is a textbook, thrilling to read. Let's get on to the next vlog. It's thrilling for me. I don't know about you. I love this stuff.